Alright, so to start off our lesson for domain and range, we're going to take a look at our warm-up from previous lessons. So the first thing I want to do is just go over how to graph these equations for you, so that way you guys can have them on your notes to start it off. So pause the video, make sure you guys do these first before we start, so then that way you guys know how to do these for these upcoming X tickets or your test. Now, so graph this function. So in other words, if I want to graph it, you always want to create a value of x's and y's, and you're going to substitute those in just to see if you get a general idea or a sketch of these graphs. So I'm going to do number 1. So number 1, I'm just going to pick, -1, 0, and 1, some simple numbers. So if I were to type these in, substitute that -1 here, and then do my operation here, -3 times -1, well, that's +3 plus 5, that's 8. If I put in 0, -3 times 0 plus 5, that's 5. If I put in 1, -3 times 1 is -3 plus 5. Since one's negative, one's positive, I know I have to subtract them. So -3 plus 5, so subtracting, I will get a 2, and since 5 is bigger, I'll get a +2. So those are my 3 points that I have for my line here, and I'm going to start graphing them. So 8 is completely off the graph, so I'm not going to worry about that, but I do have 2 good points here. So 0 and 5, and 1 and 2. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my little line graph. I noticed I moved it. So my line is going to be just like this, as straight as possible. Left to right, it's decreasing. It's has a negative slope. It's going downwards, and it's hitting that y-axis. That y-intercept point is going to be at 0, 5 here. Okay. Now let's take a look at number 2. So number 2 looks like a quadratic. How do I know it's quadratic? It has that squared up here. So that's what we're going to focus on first. So if I want to use my same table of values of y, -1, 0, and 1, let's see if we get some values here. So if I put -1 here, -1 squared, so that's basically saying -1 times -1, well, it's going to be a positive, negative times negative. So +1 minus 6, that's going to be a -5. If I put in 0, 0 to the second power, 0 times 0 is still 0. 0 minus 6, minus 6. Now 1, if I put in 1 squared, so 1 times 1 minus 6, that's also a -5. So what we're going to notice is basically I'm going to start off at this 0, 6. It's 0, -6. So 0, -6, and then I go -1, -5, 1, -5. Now quadratics are slightly different in this sense. Let's see what that 2 looks like. So I'm going to have to put in a 2. So if you notice, these two are going to be the same. So if I were to put in 2 squared, so what's 2 times 2? It's 4. 4 minus 6, that's going to be -2. So that means that 2, -2, I have this point, and since they're reflected over here, I'm going to have a -2 as well here at -2. So what's going to happen is your graph is going to look like this. It's going to come up and curve up a little bit in the shape of a parabola, a U shape, in this general direction. Okay. Now let's take a look at the next one, absolute value. So basically any number I substitute in here is going to come out as a positive value as well. So I'm going to use my x and y. So I'm going to plug in -1, 0, and 1. So if I put in -1, now the -1 turns into a +1. So 1 plus 1, that'll be 2. Put in 0, 0 plus 1, 1. Put in a +1, it's going to come out positive, so 1 plus 1 again, 2. So it's going to be kind of similar to this setup, but not really. So we want to add in another number. So let's try 3. -3 and 3. So if I were to type in -3 in here, comes out as a +3. What's 3 plus 1? Now I get 4. If I put in this +3, comes out positive still. 3 plus 1, that is also 4. So this is what we're going to have set up here. So I'm going to do -3 and 4. -3, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 1 point. -1 and 2, 1, 2. 0 and 1. 1 and 2. And then this last one, 3 and 4. So if I basically connect it, This one's not going to have so much of a curve, but it's more like two straight lines going in the opposite, or two straight lines from here. So basically it's like a V. That's more, this parabola is more of a U, this was more of a V. So that's basically your warm-up for today. So make sure you guys have that jotted down, and then we'll go ahead and look at the next slide. So going over the video, just discuss what method we use to graph it, how I set it up. I want you to type it in your responses for 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so what we're learning for today is I will determine domain and range of a function in interval notation, inequalities and set notation, and you guys will write these domain and range in the function of a function in interval notation, inequalities and set notation. So there is going to be some writing. So it's like not the writing like a English class writing, but basically how we write in math. Okay, so domain. So just kind of recap, domain, we're talking about those x values. So I'm going to actually change the color that I use in my notes. So domain, we have our x values, range, we have our y's. Sometimes, depending on your teachers from before, they'll say it's the input. Range is going to be your output, your independent, your dependent, if you've seen that in your classroom. So basically what we're going to talk about are these two parts. So again, the domain of a function, you guys can type this in, it's a whole lot easier for you guys to type it in, is the set of input values for which the function is defined. Okay, so basically, in other words, any x that can work is going to be part of that domain. That whatever you pick at random, it could be a button you press, it could be numbers you choose, whatever the case may be. Now the range basically has to depend on that number of the domain. So the range of a function is the set of all possible, so that's a big key word, so possible output values, messed it up there, output values for the function. Okay, so we're talking about domain and range. So the big key part, I want you to kind of highlight it, underline it, whatever you have available, all the possible output values. So in other words, even though I can pick an x and I substitute it into a function, it may not work, and so that's going to kind of rule out that particular value for the range. So you want to make sure, especially when we're doing this activity later today, that you are paying attention to that part. Okay, so make sure you copy down, pause the video if you need to, before we move on. Okay, so kind of picturing that. So functioning machine. Everybody's seen this other machine hopefully at some point in their life, and basically when we're talking about domain and range, it's like, hey, if I were to pick one of these buttons, that's my input, that is my x, and based off that selection, if it works, I'm going to get that particular soda or that particular drink out. Basically that's what a function is going to look like. This function is going to be in place of in our class as an equation. So whatever value, whatever number I select in there, I'm going to get a unique value of y back out. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at later today. So here's the notation. So you're going to write your domain and range in these three different notations. So study this chart well. They're going to look similar. The numbers are going to be different slightly. The signs may be different. So just kind of keep an eye out for these two. So inequalities, interval notation, and set notation for domain and range for each one. Okay. Now, so if we're looking at domain and range, I have a negative, infinity, so that basically stands for infinite, never stops. So that's negative infinity, that's positive infinity. Remember, this is our less than symbol. This is our greater than. Just kind of recapping, just make sure we remember these symbols. Negative infinity. So now this part is very important. So these two, those are what we call the open interval. Okay, so when we're talking about open interval, that means it's not going to include that one particular number. It's not going to be closed at that number. To make it a closed interval, so let me change my color, so switch it. Closed intervals are going to have a bracket, or basically this little bracket part here on the sides. Okay, so whatever that particular number is, if it's closed and it's including that number, we're going to close it off here. Now the other part for set notation, this is kind of what you will see in your upper level classes, your calculus, your college courses, and things like that. So pay close attention. So this part says x is a value, and this is how you have to read it. And this part means such that x is an element of real numbers. Oops. Let me see if I can write this somewhere else. I'm gonna write down here. Okay, so we're saying that x is a value, so our x has to be a certain value that's part of this little element here. So when we're saying the real numbers, we're saying there could be negatives, there could be fractions, there could be irrationals, there could be never-ending decimals. It can include any single number you can think of for this particular topic. Same thing for our range. Y is a value such that y is an element of the real. So basically they're going to be an element of the reals, except for this part, my y is going to be greater than 0. So in other words, it's going to include all those numbers, but these numbers in particular have to be greater than 0, and that's what we're saying here. Okay, now you can write this in a different way for that range. So kind of what you'll see in their lesson today is y is a value such that y is greater than 0. You don't have to include this part, because once you say this part, you're kind of saying they're part of the real numbers that are greater than 0, so they're all positives. So that way you can look at it as that way as well. So these are some different notations that you'll definitely see in class. Okay. Clear it. Now, so let's recap. So I want you to draw a line. So basically with your line tool on your slide, your Google Slides and everything, I want you to draw a line from dot to dot, which one matches. So look back at that your previous notes and say, hey, which one of these basically stands out as interval notation. I want you to draw a line to wherever it goes to. So there's going to be 3 lines, of course. So 3 lines. Do that part before we get into our actual examples for class for today.